Hey everybody, Tony here with my review of Giuseppe Verdi's Simon Boccanegra, which I saw at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. The conductor was Yader Binyamini, the production was done by Vasily Barkatov, the sets were done by Zinovi Margolin, the costumes were done by Olga Shaishmelashvili, the lights were handled by Alexander Sivayev, the videographer was Martin Eidenberger, the assistant director was Lea Teos, the chorus master was Jeremy Bynes, and the dramaturg was Sebastian Hanuza. My experience with Verdi's Boccanegra is mainly limited to the arias. Il lacerato spirito, sung by Jacopo Fiesco, Come in quest'ora bruna, sung by Amelia Grimaldi, who is then revealed to be Maria Boccanegra, Plebe, Patrizi, sung by the titular hero, Simon Boccanegra, Sento avampar nell'anima, sung by Gabriele Adorno, the scene between Paolo and Pietro, Quei due vedesti, which then leads into Paolo's solo, Me sento maledetto. Suffice it to say, Giuseppe Verdi composed such brilliant music amidst a really ridiculous plot, which should be no surprise because Simon Boccanegra was also based on the play of the same name written by Antonio Garcia Gutierrez, who is the same gentleman who penned El Trovador, which subsequently turned into Verdi's opera Il Trovatore. There are also some parallels between Il Trovatore and Simon Boccanegra. There's the whole convoluted mess of the missing child. In Trovatore, there is Manrico, who is then revealed to be Conte di Luna's missing brother, although he has been raised as Azucena's son, and Azucena screams out that her mother has been finally avenged because she realized too late that she threw the wrong baby into the fire pit. And the whole backdrop of Trovatore's story not only has some political intrigue going on between Conte di Luna and Manrico being enemies, especially considering that they serve two different kingdoms, but it's also in the backdrop of some gypsy magic elements, considering that Azucena is constantly called a witch and that her mother was also being burnt at the stake. And of course, Azucena wants to avenge her mother from being punished by Di Luna's father. And of course, let's not forget that Trovatore was set in Spain. In Simon Boccanegra, on the other hand, this is set in Italy, specifically in Genoa, amidst the contention between the plebeians and the patricians. More specifically, the plebeians, who are in layman's terms the commoners, and the patricians, who are in layman's terms the aristocrats. And aside from this historical backdrop is the whole convoluted story of the missing daughter. In this case, it is Amelia Grimaldi, who is originally known as Maria Boccanegra. There's this whole messy story that the older Maria Boccanegra died and has left behind a granddaughter. The young girl grew up to be Amelia Grimaldi because she was a foundling who was raised by Andrea Grimaldi, who in actuality was Jacopo Fiesco. Simon Boccanegra was once married, but his daughter was missing, and he sees that Amelia Grimaldi was the missing daughter, until it's revealed at the end that Jacopo Fiesco and Maria Boccanegra were actually related, as Maria was actually the granddaughter of Jacopo. So there's this whole convoluted story filled with melodrama occurring in Simon Boccanegra, but at least there were some deviations from making Simon Boccanegra a total downer ending. At least the tenor and the soprano, i.e. Gabriele and Amelia aka Maria, end up being married, but the baritone father figure dies while the bass father figure lives. And aside from having a tenor and soprano being lovers, there's not only one bass and baritone pair. No, there are two bass and baritone pairs. The father figures of Jacopo Fiesco and Simon Boccanegra, and the villain duo of the main baddie, Paolo Albiani, and Pietro, who is the crony. What's also interesting about Simon Boccanegra was that the original version premiered in 1857 in Venice, and the reworked version in 1881 premiered in Milan. Suffice it to say, the 1857 version was a fiasco, which then had to be reworked in 1881. And what was different about the 1881 version was that Paolo Albiani's role was expounded a lot more, especially when it came to his solo number, Me Sento Maledetto. And there's also the council scene that became a lot more expounded, and there was also the arrangement of the acts. The original 1857 version had 4 acts, whereas the reworked 1881 version had the prologue and 3 acts to follow. The basic plot for Simon Boccanegra goes like this. Paolo Albiani, a goldsmith, and Pietro, one of the leaders of the Genoese people, planned to elect a corsair by the name of Simon Boccanegra as the new Doge of Genoa. This also means that Simon pleads the hand of Jacopo Fiesco's daughter, Maria, for marriage, to which Jacopo is completely against it, until one fateful day, Jacopo loses Maria and mourns for her death. And she leaves behind a young girl, and this young girl will be a very important character for both Jacopo Fiesco and Simon Boccanegra. Things go according to plan by Paolo and Pietro, as Simon ends up being elected as the new Doge, much to Fiesco's surprise. And some 20 years later, the young girl grows up to a young woman by the name of Amelia Grimaldi, who is madly in love with Gabriele Adorno, who is also a political enemy of the Boccanegras. Simon then reveals that Amelia Grimaldi is actually his daughter, Maria Boccanegra, who he has been searching for many years because he lost her when she was still a little child, and he also lost his wife as she unfortunately passed away. Simon and Amelia, aka Maria, end up embracing each other as father and daughter, but Paolo is not having any of it, as he is fully aware that Gabriele and Amelia, aka Maria, are in love with each other. So what does he do to spoil their happy union? He ends up planning an abduction, of course. His plan ends up being exposed by Simon, and Simon in turn curses him, ostracizes him, and banishes him in front of everybody. Paolo is not one to give up without a fight, as he plants his seed of revenge against Simon by poisoning his cup of water. Once Simon ends up drinking that poisoned cup of water, his conscience ends up giving way. There's just so much pain that he feels in his body and his mind. He needs to admit and confess to the people around him, such as Gabriele, Amelia, aka Maria, and Jacopo. Gabriele Adorno, who has been a political enemy of the Boccanegras for many years, as Simon killed his father, is shocked to know that Simon is Amelia's father. Amelia Grimaldi, aka Maria Boccanegra, is also shocked to know that she herself is the granddaughter of Jacopo Fiesco, and Jacopo Fiesco managed to finally find his granddaughter. At least karma bites Paolo Albiani in the butt, as he reveals to the public so proudly and so brazenly that he was the one who poisoned Simon Boccanegra. And for that, he he is then led to his execution, and at least Gabriele Adorno and Maria Boccanegra end up happily married, with Gabriele being elected as the new Doge, with the unfortunate Simon passing away from the poison. So Simon Boccanegra's story was rather convoluted, as you can clearly tell. But what more than compensates the story was the glorious music, ranging from Jacopo Fiesco's A te l'estremo addio, which then leads into the main aria, Il lacerato spirito, up until Gabriele Adorno's impassioned Sento avamparne l'anima, and Amelia Grimaldi's, aka Maria Boccanegra's, gorgeous aria, Come in quest'ora bruna, and even Simon Boccanegra's plea to the people, Plebe Patrizi. Now that I talked about some basic tidbits of Simon Boccanegra, let's get into what I thought about the production. I was not a fan of this particular production of Simon Boccanegra. I do understand what they were trying to do. Based on my understanding, they were trying to make Simon Boccanegra a crime drama, a political drama set in the 21st century, as opposed to what the libretto has with the action taking place in 14th century Genoa. What was just as distracting about the production was just how the lights end up being turned on and off, as if to show that there was just something being retconned and something that didn't end up moving the plot along. And there is also the existence of a plasma screen television that showed not only Jacopo's past, but also Simon's and Amelia's quote-unquote illicit actions, and even the plebeians and patricians fighting each other. Amelia's scene does not open in a garden where she is anxiously waiting for Gabriele. Instead, she finds herself in a college dormitory. And I thought that having Come in quest'ora bruna being sung in a college dormitory alongside her maid and another friend completely robbed the total aloneness and the anxiousness that Amelia has in terms of waiting for her beloved Gabriele to return. At least the production did have some interesting moments in which the people are gathered to see Simon Boccanegra, and they're gathered to the festivities. And at least the costumes were kind of nice to look at, although there's that huge part of me that wants a traditional production. What's also worth noting about this production is a woman's voice announcing in Italian the current events of what is going on with Simon Boccanegra and his missing daughter, and everything that is going on in Genoa regarding Simon Boccanegra, Jacopo Fiesco, Maria Boccanegra, and the people of Genoa in general. Another pet peeve of mine about this production was just how drab it looked. It didn't look that vibrant or exciting. It tries to be, but there were just times where I was left having my head scratched. And at least the biggest strength of this production was just how the characters interacted with each other, although I really would have loved to have a traditional production of Simon Boccanegra, because if viewers and listeners have never heard of Simon Boccanegra, which is kind of understandable because it's not one of Verdi's most popular operas of all time, although it is part of the standard repertoire, they would be easily confused as to what is going on without first reading the libretto or having some background knowledge of what Simon Boccanegra is all about. So for newbies coming into Simon Boccanegra with no idea of what this opera is about, I would not recommend this production. For those of you who have been very experienced with Simon Boccanegra and know about the story, have seen traditional productions and want to compare it, I might recommend it, but intermittently. So while I'm not a huge fan of this production of Simon Boccanegra, there are some moments that I did relatively enjoy, such as how the characters interacted, and at least the plasma screen television was kind of fun to look at. But like I said, I really would have loved to have a traditional production in which the action is set in 14th century Genoa. I know there are people in the comments down below who are going to say, oh, it's just artistic expression, get over it. But please hear me out. If you're a viewer who has never heard about Simon Boccanegra, would you want to go into this production not knowing anything about the story or not knowing anything about the original story at least? I really wouldn't think so. So you're better off sticking to Simon Boccanegra set in the original period, directed by somebody who has truly read the libretto and has truly scoured through the libretto without projecting their own ideas of what it's going to look like. If you know about Simon Boccanegra and have seen traditional productions and want to give this a try, just approach this with caution. Enough about my rambling on the production. I want to talk about the singers, starting off with George Petean as Simon Boccanegra. This role is just as coveted for many a dramatic baritone, let alone a Helen baritone. Specifically if that baritone mainly specializes in a lot of the Italian works, specifically Verdi and Puccini. A lot of successful Simon Boccanegras would then go on to sing Scarpia from Tosca, Jack Rance from La Fanciulla del West, Amonasro from Aida, Telramund from Lohengrin, Nabucco from Verdi's Nabucco, Falstaff from Verdi's Falstaff, and of course, Rigoletto, Conte di Luna, and Giorgio Germont. And there are also some baritones who sang Boccanegra who would venture to sing Wotan, Klingsor, Amfortas, Kurvenal, Johanna Ann, and to some extent Herr von Faninal from Rosenkavalier. There has been no shortage of famous interpreters of Simon Boccanegra, including Lawrence Tibbett, Tito Gobbi, Piero Capuccilli, and Gian Giacomo Guelfi, just to name a few, with my personal favorites being Lawrence Tibbett and Gian Giacomo Guelfi. George Petean's performance of Simon Boccanegra does leave a bit to be desired vocally, but at least theatrically, he does carry the dignity, the strength, and that wizened attitude of the Doge with some virility to match here and there. While there are moments where I thought his singing was relatively good, there were several occasions where he was barking, where his tone was unsteady and unsupported, and he just seemed rather all over the place in terms of how he vocally executed his lines, which is a shame because when he sang those softer moments, there was a semblance of squillo. However, when he went all out and all loud, he resorted to glorified screaming, which is a huge shame on his instrument. Because who I have in my ears when it comes to exceptional baritones singing Simon Boccanegra are, as of course, my two most favorite interpreters of the role, Lawrence Tibbett and Gian Giacomo Guelfi. And I also love Tito Gobbi as Simon Boccanegra because he was a wonderful singing actor who was able to do a lot of fabulous work with father figures, anti-heroes, and his great forte being villains. And even the much older baritones of the past, such as Benvenuto Franci, Domenico Viglione Borghese, Mattia Battistini, Titta Ruffo, Ettore Bastianini, Gino Becchi, Apollo Granforte, Pasquale Amato, Giuseppe De Luca, Giuseppe Danise, and lest I forget about Giuseppe Taddei, were absolutely wonderful baritones that I would have loved George Petean to emulate. Despite whatever issues I had with Petean's Simon Boccanegra, at least he was still a dedicated performer who brought out some of the troubles and the pains that Boccanegra has, although I would have loved for his voice to gain in chestiness and gain in actual richness and depth, rather than just resorting to screaming his lines out. Therefore, George Petean does have a flawed instrument with some decent moments to be found here and there, but I really would have loved for him to be a lot more consistent with his tone, a lot more consistent with his chest tones, and just basically use that potential well to not abuse it, but make something better of what he can do as a singing actor. This is someone I do not want to see his star fade anytime soon because he does have good and interesting material. It's just how he produces his voice that is quite the concern for me, and I really do hope that George Petean improves over time, because as I heard him sing in the gentler moments, he did have a semblance of depth, and I really would love to hear and see him take advantage of that depth more so that he can build his voice up in the right direction and even be inspired by a lot of the old school baritones of the past. Another singer whose career I have been following for a very long time was Liang Li, who sang the role of Jacopo Fiesco. Jacopo Fiesco is just as coveted as his baritone counterpart Simon Boccanegra in terms of having either a basso cantante or a basso profondo singing this iconic role. He not only has his signature aria, A te l'estremo addio, which then leads into the main aria, Il lacerato spirito, to sing, but he also has to act convincingly well as a wizened old man who has bitterness, but eventually finds it in his heart to forgive his enemy and also realize that he has found his granddaughter, but it's too late to make amends for somebody who tried so hard to be his friend, but the walls of hatred ended up blocking them. There has been no shortage of basso cantantes and basso profondos who have sung Jacopo Fiesco, and those include Alexander Kipnis, Ezio Pinza, Cesare Siepi, Jerome Hines, Nikolai Yorov, Evgeny Nesterenko, and Samuel Ramey. And these basses have also gone on to sing the likes of Don Giovanni, Sarastro, Filippo II from Don Carlo, Ramfis from Aida, Sparafucile from Rigoletto, Colline from La Bohème, Heinrich de Vogler from Lohengrin, both Veit Pogner and Hans Sachs from Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, König Marke from Tristan und Isolde, Marcel from Les Huguenots, and Bertram from Robert le Diable. And what sets Jacopo Fiesco apart from the likes of Mephistopheles and Don Giovanni is that he's not an evil character. He leans towards more of Sarastro in terms of being a benevolent yet troubled character. Therefore, many a basso cantante and or basso profondo need to show that benevolence, but that trouble in his voice exceedingly well. Liang Li was able to convey Jacopo Fiesco's pain, anguish, and moments of warmth quite well. And while I do like the fact that he was able to use the depth of his voice to the greatest of his advantage, there were several occasions where he had some vocal troubles. There were occasions where I heard some wobbles. There were occasions where he tended to disappear in the orchestra. There were even occasions where his tone was unsteady. Nevertheless, he did pick up the pace. He did give it his all in terms of characterization and in terms of what he was able to accomplish as a singer. And he was able to at least do a laudable job in terms of conveying the emotions of Jacopo Fiesco and for finding moments of depth in his voice. Perhaps his greatest highlight was his rendition of Il lacerato spirito. Yes, I've heard better and stronger versions, such as the ones I've listened to from Jerome Hines, Cesare Siepi, Giorgio Tozzi, and Nikolai Gyaurov, and especially with Nikolai Gyaurov and Cesare Siepi being my most favorite ones of all time. However, Liang Li did a serviceable job in that particular aria and in the role as a whole. So I still have to give him some credit where credit is due, and I still have to give him some props for at least being a committed performer from beginning to end. Graduating from the character part of Baron du Fol from La Traviata yesterday into singing the more pivotal role of Paolo Albiani, the devious goldsmith, was Michael Baghdadze. As opposed to Simon Boccanegra's grandeur in the Verdi baritone roles, Paolo Albiani needs a villain baritone, let alone a character baritone, to bring out the nastiness and the evilness of this particular role. Yes, there have been some baritones who have sung Papageno or Wolfram or even the Herald who have found themselves singing Paolo Albiani, but many Paolo Albianis would then go on to sing the likes of Iago from Otello and to some extent Ford from Falstaff. But there have also been Paolo Albianis who graduated from this villain to singing Simon Boccanegra, and those include Leonard Warren and Cheryl Mills. Furthermore, there have also been bass baritones who sang Paolo Albiani, including Justino Diaz, Ezio Flagello, and José Vendôme, who was actually more of a baritone. And I thought that Michael Baghdadze was a serviceable Paolo Albiani. While he wasn't really as exciting as many of the baritones of the past, let alone the bass baritones who sang Paolo Albiani, including Ezio Flagello and Justino Diaz, he was able to at least give this character some evilness, although it was kind of hindered by an otherwise woolly tone, which is a shame because Michael Baghdadze had excellent material to work off of in terms of his repertoire. He sang Escamillo, he sang Klingsor and Amfortas, and he had a lot of the great baritone roles under his belt. However, his voice could have used a lot more polish, a lot more darkness and depth, and a whole lot more chest and squillo. Michael Baghdadze's voice is one that I hope will continue to grow in strength and virility because he does have awesome material, and I just hope that his voice will continue going into the right direction and not end up in operatic mediocrity. Patrick Rowan was a fine and handsome Pietro. As opposed to the equally grand role of Fiesco, Pietro does require a character bass, but don't think for 1 millisecond that a character bass has to sing half-ass as Pietro. No, that's not the case. Pietro still needs a full-bodied bass to embody this character part, which, although thankless, still needs a virile sing. And that's where you get basses such as Norman Scott and Louis D'Angelo, who sang this role and made it their own. And there have been also Pietros who went on to sing either Fiesco or even the monk from Don Carlo, and to some extent Dottor Bartolo from Il Barbiere di Siviglia, with results that therefore showed their technical prowess. Patrick Rowan does have potential to keep on growing as a fine bass baritone, and he does have a nice timbre that makes me realize that there is something that can make him continue to grow and flourish in the right direction. He has an equally strong stage presence and really good musicality, and here's hoping that Mr. Rowan will grow in the right direction, will work on his technique the best way he can, and will not give in to bad habits, because there is a voice that can grow in depth, grow in roundness and richness, and grow in the right way possible, and even provide him sufficient room for him to truly polish his craft as a singing actor. So here's hoping that Padraig Rowan will go to all these new and exciting heights, especially in the opera world, and will continue with perseverance and a whole lot of charisma. Attilio Glaza's lyric tenor voice, which just brims with charisma and grows in strength, definitely impressed me as Gabriele Adorno. Now, many spinto tenors have also made Gabriele Adorno their own, and what you really need in Gabriele is a sort of sword-like quality, the one that can pierce through an orchestra effectively and easily, but also sing lyrically and beautifully. This is evidenced in Sento avampar nell'anima, in which he has all this rage and he has all of that bite in his emotions and his voice, and any great spinto tenor needs to convey that. And there have also been some tenors who've made the role of Gabriele Adorno their own, such as Giuseppe Campora and Carlo Bergonzi, just to name a few. Yes, Carlo Bergonzi was naturally a full lyric tenor, and the same thing can be said about Giuseppe Campora, who was one of my most favorite interpreters of Gabriele Adorno of all time. And Attilio Glaza continues to go from strength to strength as one of the finest lyric tenors I have ever heard. His voice just rang throughout the orchestra. He threw himself in with emotional abandon and sufficient virile charm. Yes, there might be some people who think that his voice was too small for Gabriele Adorno, but I would argue that Attilio Glaza's voice was decently sized and it served Gabriele Adorno's passion and youthful manliness to such a fine and high degree. Is he as great as, let's say, Giuseppe Campora or Carlo Bergonzi, let alone Beniamino Gigli or many other great tenors of the past? No, not by a long shot, but he was able to use that strong lyric tenor instrument of his to such a great effect, and he was able to inject this role with sufficient excitement and sufficient passion to the point where he was one of the best performers of the evening. Singing his lover, Amelia Grimaldi, aka Maria Boccanegra, was Maria Motolighina. Now, Amelia Grimaldi, aka Maria Boccanegra, has attracted many full lyric sopranos, let alone spinto sopranos, and they have also gone on to sing the likes of Desdemona from Otello, Elisabetta di Valois from Don Carlo, Aida from Aida, and even to some extent Liu from Turandot and the Empress from Die Frau ohne Schatten. And lest I forget about the Wagner E's, Elsa from Lohengrin, Elisabeth from Tannhäuser, and Eva Pogner from the Meistersinger von Nürnberg. Notable interpreters of Maria Boccanegra, aka Amelia Grimaldi, have been Victoria de los Angeles, Antonietta Stella, and even Montserrat Caballé and Mirella Freni. Basically, spinto / full lyric sopranos who have had exciting careers in the Italian repertoire, whether it be from Verdi or Puccini, or even both the bel canto works and the verismo works. There is no doubt that many a spinto soprano, let alone to some extent full lyric sopranos, have flocked to sing this role that requires a virginal temperament, but at the same time sufficient strength and fidelity, especially for the love that she has for Gabriele in terms of romance, and in terms of filial love, both Simon Boccanegra and Jacopo Fiesco. Maria Motolighina was sufficiently exciting as a rising spinto soprano, and her voice just bloomed throughout the theater with abandon. Yes, there were occasions where I thought that she could have used her chest tones a lot more, and I would thoroughly encourage her to embrace those chest tones, because that is where all the meat is, and that is where all the depth is in terms of making her voice truly powerful. But that is a small price to pay in terms of what Maria Motolighina had to offer as a wonderful singing actress. She brought in youthful innocence to Amelia, aka Maria. She brought in charm to this role, and more than anything, her vocal resources were absolutely sufficient in terms of making Maria, aka Amelia, a really charismatic character. And there is a great future for Maria Motolighina in roles such as Elisabeth from Tannhäuser, Elsa from Lohengrin, Eva Pogna from the Meistersinger from Nürnberg, Chrysothemis from Electra, Elisabetta di Valois from Don Carlo, the Empress from the Frau ohne Schatten, and even Arabella from Richard Strauss's Arabella. If she continues to develop her technique in the right way, I am really confident that Maria Motolighina will find herself singing these grand roles with abandon, but she has to continue strengthening her technique and also be very wise with her choice of repertoire, because Maria Motolighina's instrument has potential to keep on growing and glowing with sheen and lustrous beauty. She has an instrument that can ring throughout the theater, and here's hoping that her career will go on for long periods of time. And here's also hoping that great conductors with good ears and even vocal specialists with equally good ears will take care of her voice, which has loads of potential to keep on shining. I also have to give my hat off to Patrick Cook's finely sung Captain and Karis Tucker's equally gorgeous Handmaiden, because they were able to be absolutely fine in their small roles, and they were able to sing just as gorgeously as the main characters. So while the singing did have its issues from the lower voiced males, it was really Attilio Glaza's and Maria Motolighina's evening, as they were able to sing their respective roles with abandon. Overlooking the issues that I had with George Petian's tendency to bark, Yang Li's occasional wobble, Michael Baghdad's not having sufficient depth to make Paolo truly threatening, but the potential Patrick Rowan has to keep on growing as a fine bass baritone, I still have to give loads of kudos and praise to Attilio Glaza and Maria Motolighina for soldiering on, especially Attilio Glaza, who I have seen grow and blossom to the finest tenor he could be, and Maria Motolighina for proving herself to be one of the finest young spinto sopranos I have ever heard, and here's hoping that her future will be brilliant. The conducting done by Yader Bignamini was quite wonderful to listen to. He made sure that the orchestra and the chorus managed to work together well. He paid attention to where something had to be emotional and booming. And lest I forget about the orchestra and chorus of the Deutsche Oper Berlin. They have always been reliable, and they have always been such fine troopers. So while I did not have a lot of great feelings about the production, while I thought some of the singing was rather mixed in my opinion, I still have to give my hat off to Attilio Glaza and Maria Motolighina for soldiering on and for having such strong stage presences and equally strong voices. And lest I forget about the potential I can see in both Attilio Glaza and Maria Motoligina. I would even love to see Attilio Glaza attempt roles such as Faust and even Holdunagi from Les Huguenots, and Maria Motoligina have a go at Madame Lidouane from De l'Ordre de Carmelite, Valentine du Sambre from Les Huguenots, and many other great roles designated for a spinto soprano. The possibilities for these two are there, and here's also hoping that George Peteyan, Liang Li, Mikhail Bakhtadze, and Patrick Rowan continue to grow in the right direction and not have their stars fade anytime soon. And I also have to give such high salutes and high marks to Patrick Cook and Karis Tucker for serving the small roles well. Furthermore, I still have to give my props off to Yader Binyamini for conducting with abandon, even to the point where his first baton was flung out of him while he was conducting and landed in the front seat area, but he was still able to soldier on throughout the second part of the opera. So at least there was some laudability to be found with this production of Simon Boccanegra. And for those of you who caught Giuseppe Verdi's Simon Boccanegra at the Deutsche Oper Berlin, what'd you think of it? Did you enjoy this production, or did you find it rather meaningless in terms of what it was trying to convey? Was there a singer you particularly enjoyed, whether it be George Peteyan, Liang Li, Mikhail Bakhtadze, Patrick Rowan, Attilio Glaza, or Maria Motoligina? Or was this entire production, let alone the singers, not to your liking? Comment below and let me know. Well, that's it for my review of Giuseppe Verdi's Simon Boccanegra. Tune in tomorrow for my review of Bizet's Carmen at the Staatsoper unter den Linden. So until then, good night everybody.